Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host for today, Jessica Sutherland, here with Jonathan Benson, lecturer in political theory at the University of Manchester. Jonathan's research focuses on democratic theory with a strong connection to the interdisciplinary work in PPE, so politics, philosophy and economics, and looks at both theoretical and practical challenges to democracy. Today, he is here to talk to us about epistocracies and democratic scepticism, more specifically about why we should value democracy because of its epistemic goods. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
As always on this show, the first question that we would like to ask you is, in a sentence, what do you see as the single biggest problem with democracy?
So in just one sentence, I would say that as currently practiced, the biggest problem would be the outsized influence of a small set of economic interests on the political process, and the difficulty in finding democratic mechanisms which can overcome that.
Great, thank you. So by way of introduction into your work then, what is democratic scepticism and why is it a problem?
So democratic scepticism refers to the view that rather than being the kind of best form of government, democracy is rather inherently incompetent, ignorant, and irrational. Now, that view has a long history, right? As long as there's been democracy, there are people who have made the kind of claim that rule by the people is a kind of recipe for disaster, right? You can see this kind of view in the works of people like Plato. But it's seen a kind of contemporary resurgence in the academic study of democracy in recent years, with a number of philosophers, but also political scientists and economists arguing that democracy is really plagued by these fundamental problems like voter ignorance or voter irrationality, or things like the inefficiency of centralized democratic institutions. And these kind of new democratic skeptics often go as far as to argue that these problems of ignorance and irrationality should lead us to either reduce the scope of democracy, so replacing democratic politics with things like free markets wherever possible, or even removing democracy completely, right? Either by making the right to vote dependent on some kind of political knowledge test, right? So you have to pass the test to gain the right to vote. This is sometimes referred to as a system of epistocracy. And some have also looked to places like China and Singapore for alternatives, where they would advocate for political leaders being selected via examinations, right, or past experience in political office. So these democratic skeptics, they have a kind of range of alternatives to democracy they prefer, but they all kind of are united by this idea that democracy really lacks a certain kind of intelligence, right? It exacts an epistemic capacity, so the capacity to use knowledge and information effectively. And therefore, it's going to kind of be an inherently incompetent political procedure, which is going to lead us to bad decisions.
Great, thanks. So for listeners that perhaps aren't familiar with the academic debates about democracy, why have people become so critical of democracy and increasingly so?
So in many ways, the reason why people in the academic study of democracy have become more skeptical is similar to how many people in everyday life have, right? So surveys show that people's confidence and support for democracy is waning. And this is often correlated with what might be seen as certain failures in governance, so economic downturns or kind of more locally botched policies. Right, and we live in a time now where, of course, people are complaining about the rise of political leaders that they see as unqualified, right, and perhaps even demagogic. So Donald Trump in the US would be the most prominent example. Right? They complain about the rise of misinformation and polarization, the disconnect between the increasingly complex policy problems like climate change and AI to how much the average voter seems to know about those challenges. And those in the academic debates, I think, are also very much motivated by these sets of concerns. The difference is that they then bring what they see as a strong body of evidence from the political and social sciences to support the idea that really these problems are kind of innate to democracy. Right? So they would say that political science has shown us that the average voter really doesn't know much about the policies that are on offer at election time, right? That they are inherently biased in the way that they consume information, or that politicians necessarily lack information about the day-to-day lives and problems of citizens, right? So it's that kind of general, I think, atmosphere which motivates them to gravitate towards these bodies of evidence, which they've put forward to try to show why, this isn't an accident. We have these problems because of something fundamental about democratic politics.
So is the argument then that these problems are just kind of baked into democracy itself and we can't just fix it with reform? So we need to kind of start from the ground up rather than trying to fix democracy?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So perhaps one of the most common arguments you'll see amongst democratic skeptics is around voter ignorance, right? And it will appeal to kind of economic theory, which is called rational ignorance, right? So here is the idea is individual voters only get one vote amongst millions. The probability that their vote therefore makes a difference is tiny. And therefore the benefit of making sure that that one vote is well informed is also tiny. Right, you have to spend a lot of time getting yourself informed about politics, motivating yourself to think critically and independently about politics, right? And the idea is that at election time, you just simply do not have that incentive because your vote is very unlikely to make a difference, right? So that's just baked into the structure of what democratic elections are. Similarly, the free market kind of democratic skeptics would say, look, there's just a necessary problem with taking decisions by some kind of centralized democratic body, that it will just necessarily be disconnected from the local and dispersed forms of knowledge that individuals have in a society, right? That's something which consumers and firms in the marketplace can have, but it's something which you just cannot centralize to a single democratic body. Okay, so again, it's seen to be inherent to democracy. Therefore, we need to look for these alternatives, whether that be free markets or moving to more elite forms of politics.
Great, thanks. So hopefully it's not all doom and gloom, because your book titled Intelligent Democracy, Answering the New Democratic Scepticism focuses on kind of defending democracy against all of these skeptics from an epistemic angle. So related to the ways that democracy helps us to gather and interpret knowledge and make decisions, etc. So in simple terms then, what are some of the epistemic benefits of democracy? So put in more simple way, why is democracy intelligent?
Good. So the thing to keep in mind is I don't think there is any one reason why democracy is intelligent, right? So I think a problem with many of the democratic skeptics is they tend to reduce democracy to a single institution, most typically elections, right? And then they'll look at the limitations of elections, such as the limits to voter knowledge, and they'll use that to say that, look, democracy is therefore fundamentally flawed. Democracy, however, is not reducible to just elections, right? Democratic politics involves a system which includes things like elections, but also includes parliaments, includes parliamentary committees, special advisors. It includes an open public sphere for scientific organizations and social movements and campaign groups. And my argument is that, look, any one of these components of a democratic system may have its limitations, right? But when we look at the system together and how these different institutions work together, we can see that it becomes an intelligent system as a whole. So as a whole, that democratic system can do things like gather and evaluate information. It can experiment with different kinds of alternatives. It can make use of the diversity within the population. And it can help motivate decision makers towards the public interest, right? Make sure decisions are not only made in the interest of a small kind of minority of the community or of the population, right? And it's only the reason why the system can do this is only because it involves these different institutions, right? So for example, take elections. So the democratic skeptics are not wrong that there are limits to how much the average voter knows about public policy and the kind of policies that are on offer at election time, right? It's not the case, however, that the whole burden of making informed political decisions falls on the shoulders of individual voters, right? Instead, you have parliaments, you have special committees, you have an open public sphere, which involves scientific institutions, think tanks, social movements and campaign groups that all organize around certain kinds of problems in society and communicate their consequences and impacts in order that they could come to influence public policy in some way, right? So democracy has this epistemic ability to gather and communicate knowledge, but that comes through a number of different bodies and actors working together, right? It doesn't fall just on the shoulders of voters, it falls on the broader system, right? In the same way, I think that the system can also then work to engage in experimentation, utilize diversity, motivate decision makers. And it's all these kind of epistemic tools put together that create a kind of intelligent political system, which is democracy.
Great, thank you. So is this division of labour then really important to the way that a democracy kind of gathers and interprets and maybe even disseminates their knowledge, do you think?
Yeah, so the idea of thinking about it as a system means you have to think about all of these epistemic abilities as involving a certain kind of division of labor, right? So if we just think about trying to get hold of information about social problems to inform political decisions, well, no one institution would even be aware of all of the different problems we face in a society, let alone know where to search out and find information about them, right? It wasn't for countless numbers of scientific institutions that we'd be aware of the problem of climate change. Right? It's not without the work of community associations and campaign groups and social movements organizing around collective problems that we would understand that there are problems in need of address within society, right? And therefore, even to go out and start to find information about how those problems are actually affecting people and how you might go about best solving them, right? So you need a division of labor where different institutions have forms of specialization, right? The IPCC specializes on scientific knowledge around climate change. The PAR social movement focuses on the problem of evictions, right, and mortgage indebtedness, and organizes around those things. Shelter on homelessness, the feminist movement on gender relations, right? There's forms of specialization within the democratic system. And that is what allows all of this information to come to the surface. And that is really a great value of democracy because it allows this open public sphere where institutions have the ability to specialize and to choose and voice what they think is important, right? And of course, less democratic, more closed elite systems often end up wanting to constrain the public sphere in order to protect, you know, the interests of those in power. But in doing that, they cut off this division of labor, right? So you always have to think about what allows for this division of labor to come about because no one institution can do it alone.
Thank you. And as you said earlier, we kind of typically end up equating democracy with the use of elections as part of this kind of like decentralization of decision making. And in your book, you make comparisons between the ways that decisions are made through elections and the way that they're made through the free market and consumers' decisions. So why don't you think these mechanisms, so either the elections or the free market, make for a good division of labour in decision making? So what are some of the problems that they might face, and are there any alternatives?
So I should firstly say that I think that both markets and elections do have an important role in society, right? There are many important goods which you're going to need markets to provide, right? You don't want to provide everything through the state. And elections, I think, play a fundamental role as guards against abuses of power, right, in a democratic system, right? So they have their role to play. I think, however, that the epistemic value that's often placed on those institutions is in some sense overstated, or at least it has certain important limitations. And actually the limitations are common to each of these institutions. Okay, so the thing that both elections and markets have in common is they try to decentralize decision-making to individuals. Right? It's individual consumers in the marketplace who choose between the rival goods provided by different firms. And it is individual voters in elections who choose between the policy packages of rival political parties. Right? Those individuals making those decisions, selecting which of the alternatives that they best prefer. And this is normally said to have certain epistemic benefits. Perhaps the most common two are the idea that individuals are often well motivated to acquire information and take decisions for themselves. And they can make use of what's normally referred to as local knowledge. So kind of knowledge of their own situation, their own circumstances, and that can then inform their decisions. Right? So John Dewey has this kind of famous phrase that the person who wears the shoe knows best where it pinches. Right? There's a certain kind of local knowledge which is important. Very often, both markets and elections can realize these kinds of epistemic abilities more or less imperfectly. I think a big problem for them, however, is when we move to taking social decisions which have a other regarding dimension. right? So when it comes to politics, we don't only care about our own position and self-interest. We care about realizing our concerns for justice or the common good, which expand to the whole of the society or the whole of the community. Right? We care about things like the distribution of goods, economic rights and human rights. We care about cultural values, right? We care about many of these things which are not purely about ourselves. But when you shift from decisions which are purely self-interested to decisions that involve these other regarding values, it's much harder for elections and markets to achieve their epistemic values. Okay, so if I can give you an example, think about a consumer choosing between different sources of energy in the marketplace, right? If they're concerned only with their own self-interest, right? So they're interested in having a well-lit and warm home, right? They're going to be well motivated to choose the best supply of energy, right? The cheapest and most effective, right? And they're going to be able to make the use of their own local knowledge about their own circumstances and needs for making that decision. But if they try to make that same decision, trying to account for other regarding values, so perhaps the effect of these different sources of energy on the natural environment, or perhaps the labor conditions and those who work in the production of those forms of energy. Well, now their local knowledge is not as informative, because now we're talking about the effect of their decisions on possibly very distant others that are disconnected from themselves. So their local knowledge is not as relevant, and nor do they have a clear incentive to acquire more information, because now their one vote is no longer decisive, right? Their one vote in the marketplace, right? My consumer decisions have a direct impact on my self-interest, but they don't necessarily have a direct impact on others, right? That's determined by a much larger aggregate demand of which any one consumer only has one kind of vote, so to speak, right? And the same is true of voters in elections, right? In the cases of other guiding values, these individuals face a very large burden for information about how their decisions are impacting a large number of distant others. And they don't have much incentive to overcome that burden. So therefore, we need to look to other kinds of institutions if we want a political system which can account for these other regarding concerns of the justice and of the common good.
Amazing, thank you. So it seems that we kind of need everyone to be different slices of the whole pie almost. All of these different institutions can add their own little part. And I guess that's because political situations are obviously just always complex and really difficult to navigate. For example, the other regarding values that might come up. Is there value in the cognitive diversity then that we can kind of bring to the table as voters because of just the ways that many people just think completely differently about exactly the same issue? Or is that a problem for democracy?
Yeah, so diversity, and this has been argued by a number of people in the academic debate, can be a real asset for democracy and a real epistemic asset in allowing it to better address social problems. So in my view, I think diversity plays a couple of different roles. So in one side, diversity is really important to the public sphere, right? That division of labor, that specialization that I mentioned before, that is only possible because the different institutions and actors in the public sphere think and behave in different ways. Right? It's only because they think and behave in different ways they end up specializing in different areas and creating this division of labor. Right? If they all acted in the same way, there wouldn't be any specialization. Right? So we want a diverse and open public sphere for that reason. Another way in which diversity becomes important is through forms of citizen deliberation. So if we allow citizens to deliberate, particularly within more formal institutions, then their cognitive diversity, their ability to think differently, to have different predictive models, make use of different heuristics, that can allow them to search out problems in different areas and different places, and therefore come to better decisions by drawing on this diverse set of cognitive abilities. So perhaps the person who's argued, I think, most forcefully for this is Hélène Landemont, who makes use of what's called the diversity trumps ability theorem to show that diverse groups will actually be better problem solvers than more elite but more homogeneous groups. Now, in my own view, I think that the advantages of diversity do not go quite as far as someone like Landemont claims. So given, as you mentioned before, the complexity of political problems, we can't always be assured that these diverse deliberators will all be able to recognize the best solution when they see it, and therefore kind of lead themselves to a solution which is better than that of a more kind of elite and more homogeneous group. So this is a problem with what's sometimes referred to as the oracle assumption, which is part of this cognitive, the diversity trumps ability theorem. That said, I think that the general point, however, that diversity is very valuable, still holds, right? It's just one tool in this broader system, and we should use that tool because it's one thing that democracy does really well because of its inclusivity. It's inclusive and therefore involves a greater level of diversity.
Amazing. Even with your kind of maybe slightly weaker view than Helen Landamore's diversity trumps inclusion kind of theorem, is it still not quite idealized to view public deliberation as intelligent? After all, we have obviously quite a major problem with disinformation and misinformation, and we're kind of consistently warned that citizens actually just don't know a lot about the things that they should be concerned with, and they're definitely not concerned with truth, those sorts of rhetorics.
So firstly, we don't necessarily need public deliberation to be strongly intelligent in itself. What we need it to do is play its role within a larger system so that that larger system can be intelligent. And by thinking in those terms, we can allow for many of the imperfections in public deliberation, right? So if we talk about deliberation in the public sphere, it's really messy, right? Habermas, one of the kind of fathers of deliberative democracy, right, describes the public sphere as a wild space, right? So that unstructured, that wild aspect of the public sphere is actually really important in allowing different groups and actors to find new problems and new information in ways in which any centralized authority wouldn't be able to do. But yes, it also brings limitations, but those limitations might be offset by other parts of the system, right? So all that information that bubbles up from the public sphere, that then has to go through more formal political institutions before it can become influential in policymaking, right? It needs to be laundered through parliaments, through committees, through expert advisors, through, I think, participatory institutions, right, that involve a greater number of citizens. Right, so it doesn't need to be intelligent in itself as long as it plays its role and has its limitations offset. That said, some will argue, and many of the democratic skeptics do argue, that public deliberation is simply too messy to play any kind of productive role, right? And they will point to the kind of things that you mentioned, right, such as misinformation, right, such as the biases of the average citizen. But I think something important to consider here is that many of the kinds of evidence that democratic skeptics use to kind of dismiss the effectiveness of public deliberation is often greatly overstated. In fact, there are many studies that show that citizens do have a concern for the truth, right? They are willing to revise their beliefs when they are given corrections, right? Factual corrections, even when their beliefs are aligning with their own kind of political or ideological position, right? They're willing to put the truth over politics. And many of the kind of most popular concerns about misinformation are also often overstated, right? So if we take something like fake news, which has got a lot of popular attention, I mean, one study of Twitter found that only 1% of users were responsible for 75% of all the links to fake news stories, right? And all links were the responsible of just 11%, right? So most people are easily avoiding this kind of obviously fabricated information, right? And this links to and supports much of the kind of social psychology work on fake news, which suggests that as long as citizens are kind of nudged to be reflective in some way, they can distinguish between fake and real news, right? So this is not to say that public deliberation is perfect, right? That's why we need the system view, which can help compensate for its limits. But it's also not to say that it is as ridiculously incompetent as some of the skeptics claim, right? There's actually quite a lot of evidence that public deliberation works much more effectively than it's sometimes fashionable to claim.
Great, thank you. So if this kind of representative democracy with elections and public deliberation is good but not perfect, as you say, are there anything that we could do to kind of improve the intelligence of our democracies while retaining democracy as our pillar?
Yeah, great. So I've mentioned the limits of elections, right? So because voters don't have a very large amount of information about public policy, we cannot expect them to be kind of well-tuned mechanisms for selecting the optimal policy. That's not to say that they can't have some kind of role, though. So, for example, they can be guards against many of the worst abuses of political power, which are often very easy to identify, and you don't need a lot of policy information to identify them. Right, so we need these collective institutions that can acquire more information than individuals. Elections are quite good at stopping them from abusing their power in very significant ways. But what we kind of need are better mechanisms to try to really push those collective institutions, right, these democratic assemblies, towards the public interest more significantly, right? We don't want them just to not abuse their power. We want them to use their power in the most effective way possible. And here I think we need to make greater use of different kinds of democratic mechanisms that are currently not given much influence, right? And here I particularly want to think about the use of what's called sortition or lotteries, which involve the random selection of a small group of kind of broadly representative citizens who come together in some kind of assembly, sometimes referred to as a citizens' assembly, to debate and to deliberate. And these are often used at the moment to kind of create policy advice, for example, for elected officials. But I want to suggest is that we can actually institutionalize them into a democratic system and give them more power in order that they can provide more informed and detailed kinds of accountability on elected officials. So what I suggest in the book is that we should have a sortition branch to a democratic system. And the sortition branch role would be to form many small sortition assemblies, short-term assemblies, which would be used to evaluate and scrutinize legislation that's come from an elected chamber. And then they would have the power to veto that legislation. So the idea here is that the elected chamber would pass legislation, but that would then need to pass the scrutiny of a much more informed group of citizens who'd had the time to acquire information and to deliberate. And that would be a different assembly of citizens each time, right? So we don't want to be too burdensome on average citizens. So we don't necessarily want them to form an assembly that's going to, be around for 4 or 5 years, like a kind of traditional legislature. And we want to make sure that they're not overburdened in terms of the task which faces them, right? So there's much evidence from citizens' assemblies that citizens are able to deliberate effectively and understand public policy, but these tend to be single-issue assemblies, right? We don't really have much evidence that citizens can engage in policy formation or kind of a broad evaluation of a whole policy agenda. So by using single-issue assemblies, we could use those, we could empower those to give us more informed kinds of accountability, incentivizing elected officials to think much more seriously about the collective interest and passing their decisions than you could get purely from elections alone.
This sounds like a really, really interesting idea about how we can kind of improve the intelligence, I guess, of our democracies. But as academics, we love to pick holes in things. So what sort of problems do you think these sortitions might give rise to, and can they be overcome?
Yeah, so there's a lot of problems that people bring up. So I think perhaps one of the ones that's quite common amongst the democratic skeptics is just that citizens are not going to be competent at deliberating about public policy. And as I mentioned, I think actually we have quite a lot of evidence now from citizens' assemblies and other kinds of democratic innovations. They can actually engage in those kinds of activities. What I think are the more kind of serious challenges are, firstly, the burdensomeness question, which I mentioned before, which is how burdensome can we be in terms of the time constraints that we give to these citizens we randomly select to engage in politics, and how burdensome a task can they actually engage in, right? So how much can we expect of them when they form in these assemblies? And the other, I think, very significant problem, and this is a kind of problem which has been kind of well articulated by people like Brian Pevnik and others, is the problem of capture. Right, at the moment, citizens' assemblies are quite effective, but they also lack influence, which means they've not become a real target of special interests or economic interests, right? Who, as we know from real-world politics, often have strong abilities to influence public policy in line with their interests and their needs. And as you make sortition, randomly selected assemblies, more powerful, as I'm arguing we should, these kinds of special interests are going to try much harder to influence these average citizens. So these, I think, are two really important problems when thinking about using sortition more broadly. The way I think they can be overcome is, again, by thinking in terms of a division of labor. Right? By using single issue assemblies where you have a rotation between members for different kinds of legislation, you can firstly reduce the burden that's placed on the individual citizen. Right? They have to take much less time out of their lives to do these things because it's only about a single piece of legislation. And that also, of course, reduces the cognitive burden of engaging in evaluation. But that use of short-term and rotating assemblies also reduces opportunities for elite capture, right? Because it's much harder for them to identify who they need to influence, to build up those relationships over time, which of course we see in elected assemblies, right, all the time. Special interests, they have people they work with in Parliament over time, they build up those interests, they build up that influence. We should instead be using forms of rotation, right, this division of labor between many assemblies to try to overcome this problem. And this was actually something that the Greeks understood, right? The Greeks always used sortition very famously, but they also combined it with forms of rotation to try to block any kind of strong, unequal influence of power. I think we should use something similar.
Okay, thank you. And I love that kind of link back to maybe like the birthplace of democracy almost in the Greeks. So we like to wrap up these episodes with some kind of quick-fire questions for you. So the first one is, what inspired you to write Intelligent Democracy?
So I think first and foremost, the idea that it is always kind of increasingly fashionable to deride democracy, to deride the average voter. And I think when you really take into account how difficult political decisions are, and you take into account of the alternatives that are out there, we find that actually democracy is really a fantastic mechanism, right? And really the best form of government that we've created.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of democracy?
I'm very optimistic about the potential of democracy, what democracy, when designed appropriately, can do. The practical question of whether we can actually design it in that way, sadly, we currently have more grounds for pessimism.
Whose work do you admire the most?
So the work I admire most is really from those people who work at the intersection of different disciplines, sort of engaging in democratic theory, but also empirical political science. It's one reason why I'm a big supporter of the PPE movement. So it's hard to pick any one, but numbers of people who work at that kind of intersection. So people I draw on include John Dryzek, Han Landemore, Elizabeth Anderson. These are the kinds of people I think I most admire.
What is one thing you wish our listeners knew more about when it comes to democratic deliberation?
I think the idea that it's not one thing, right? There are different kinds of deliberation. Deliberation could be structured in different ways. There are forms of deliberation which can lead to very poor outcomes. There's forms of deliberation that can lead to brilliant outcomes. So I think the quick dismissal of all of it, or the embrace of all of it is excellent, is troubling, right? I think what I'd like to know is it's a multifaceted thing with many different elements to it that we need to look at kinds and forms of deliberation.
Great, thanks. This one's maybe a bit of a tough one, but what is the most novel democratic innovation you have come across in your research?
I think I would go with the Ostbelgian model, which was initiated in the German-speaking community in Belgium. And the reason I think I like this is not only because it's one of the first cases where randomly selected assemblies were institutionalized within a political system formally, but also because it involves the kind of division of labor that I talk a lot about in the book. Right? It involves one assembly to set agendas, to think of issues that they want to discuss. Those that are discussed by smaller single issue assemblies. So it does use this idea of a division of labor, of splitting up responsibilities between different assemblies. So I think that would be my favorite one if I need to pick.
Thanks. And do you think we've outgrown how we currently do democracy?
In short, yes. I think representative democracy is by far the best system that we've managed to create. But if we're willing to give citizens, I think, more power and more space within formal institutions, we can do even better.
Thanks so much. So at the beginning of this episode, I asked you to consider what you think is the biggest problem with democracy. So given all that we've discussed in the past half an hour, If you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what do you think it would be and why?
So the things that we've discussed that would help to deal with that problem of the outsized influence of a kind of small set of economic interests, I think it is really trying to experiment with new forms of accountability which allow citizens to scrutinize public policy in the name of the public interest, but in a way which is more informed, right? Which is what these kind of randomly selected assemblies have the potential to do. Right? I really think if you had policy have to go through the check of an informed group of randomly selected citizens who are descriptively representative of the population, the kinds of legislation we have today, which is often transparently designed to benefit, small sections of the society, that would be much harder to do. So that's the kind of thing I would like to start experimenting more to improve democracy.
Thank you. That was so enlightening. And thank you, Jonathan, so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. You can find Jonathan's information in the description box below. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please remember to subscribe. I've been your host, Jessica Sutherland. Thank you so much for tuning in.